I don't think I was one of the best learners at Shaalvim. After a few weeks, looking around the base matters of Shaalvim and saying, it's quite possible that I am the worst learner in this entire yeshiva, which is a very humbling experience. It was actually in 2005 when I moved to Munich that I was having a conversation with my father, and we said, the new cycle of Daf Yomi was coming up. And we said, wouldn't it be great if we could both do Daf Yomi and be Messiahim together? At Microsoft, if you were going to do a job where you were in the field, you had to be in the field. You couldn't be commuting and doing that. So you had to agree to move your family and become a global resource. And honestly, I would say of all the places I lived, I grew professionally, but I also grew personally as well, right?
Shalom Aleichem, and welcome to Shtark Tank. Shtark Tank is a podcast about the challenges and opportunities of being a Ben Torah in the workforce. This week, we are joined by Joseph Yossi Landis. He's the co-founder and president of Nerdio. Joseph, welcome to Shtark Tank, and thank you so much for joining us.
It's good to be here, Yaakov. Thanks for having me. I've been a long-time listener of your podcast, so it's great. It's kind of surprising, when you asked me to be on the podcast. I was thinking a little bit about the pasuk in Bereshis and Lamed Bet, Parak Lamed Bet, pasuk Yud Aleph, Katonti mikol hachasadim. I mean, I look at who you have on your podcast: Rabbi Rosner, Rabbi Goldberg, Rabbi Usher Weiss, Rav Leibowitz. These are people who are the biggest purveyors of Torah in the world. I'm not quite sure what I'm doing on here, but it's great to be here talking with you.
Yeah, so I mean, it's funny that you mentioned that the dream is really to actually speak to people in the field, and from time to time we take a break and look to our Gedolim and Rebbeim for their advice as well. It's also very valuable and important. But the main purpose of this podcast is to speak to people who have life experience, Torah experience out in the business world, and you certainly have a lot of that. So before we get into all of that, let's just start with a little bit of personal background, your upbringing in Chicago, your year at Shaalvim, before we get into your career.
Yeah, so I lived when I was a kid. I actually lived in Silver Spring, Maryland, for about 9 years or so. We from about, I guess, kindergarten till 8th grade, and then we moved to Chicago. My family's from Chicago originally, a long time Chicago family, and I had the opportunity to go to both Skokie Yeshiva and Ida Crown Jewish Academy, where I graduated from, and then afterwards, I went to Shaalvim, and Shaalvim really made a big impact on me. I would say arguably a much bigger impact later in life once I realized more of the lessons that I learned at Shaalvim and how I was able to apply them, how I've been able to apply them to my day-to-day life. I then went on to college at Brandeis University for 4 years, and I started working at Microsoft. I worked for Microsoft for 23, and I think one of the most interesting parts of my time at Microsoft was the number of years that I lived abroad, the number of years that I lived outside the United States. I'm sure we'll get into that. And about a little more than 7 years ago, I left Microsoft, and along with my co-founder, Gershon Vadim Vladimirsky, we both have two names, I guess, we started a company called Nerdio, and we've been at it for about 7 years, and we could get into that as well.
So within your 23 years at Microsoft, was there like a specific area that you focused on, that you developed an expertise in, and how did that transition to your startup life afterwards?
Yeah, so again, I was there for a long time, and I would say I was always involved in and interested in sales and marketing. So I'm not a coder. I don't develop software. I was always in the, broadly speaking, sales and marketing space. And about halfway through my tenure at Microsoft, I had this incredible manager, John Pereira, and he said, you'd probably be good working outside the United States. You have this sort of group of people that spend their entire career at what you might call as corp or headquarters. And then you have a bunch of people that spend their entire career in the field. And I always had this kind of talent, I guess, of translating what's sort of going on in corp, the field, so that it could be landed in the field, if you will. So John said, why don't you go into the field and have to be a catcher of what corp is sending you? So the first abroad role I had, I moved with my family to Munich, Germany. My kids were very little, and we lived in Munich. And I was leading a organization focused on Central and Eastern Europe that was managed out of Munich, and that sort of led to a series of abroad assignments from there to the end of my career, I lived in Moscow, I lived in Prague, and then the last two roles that I had at Microsoft, I spent 3.5 years living in Bangalore, India, and about 3 years living in Sao Paulo, Brazil, before I left the company.
Wow. So I do want to focus more in this conversation. We'll talk a lot about the traveling and the living around the world and being a Torah grounded Jew in places that are not necessarily associated with the Torah infrastructure and community. But before we get to that, can you give us a little more information on what that manager saw in you that would make you good for these roles? Do you speak a lot of languages? Are you good at cross-cultural relationships? What else? What about you did he see, or what did you realize in yourself throughout this journey that made you the right fit for this role?
Yeah, he and I spoke about that a number of times, and I think that the word that kept coming up was empathy. You know, a lot of times when you're in a large corporation like Microsoft or even a mid-sized corporation, you have these folks who are out in the field that to some extent are alone. And they're very dependent on the corporate headquarters to send them guidance, send them materials, let them know what the plan is. And most of the folks who work in the corporate headquarters have actually, in most cases, never been outside the headquarters. They've never traveled to these regions. I've always had this perspective in business that the truth is found in the field. If you're building a company or you're building a product or you're building some kind of initiative, the best place to go to get the real information are the people who are going to consume your product. So, you know, you go to customers, you go to partners, you go to the field sellers, and you ask them what's working. And I think at that point in my career, I had sort of developed an understanding that that was an important thing to do. I would travel out into the different regions and uh, speak to folks and do a lot of listening and understand what was really needed. And then I'd go back to the headquarters and try to create those materials that would help them be the most successful. So I was always kind of in those sorts of roles. And I think, my manager said, well, why don't you try, the other shoe on? Why don't you sit in the field? And that way you could sort of give feedback back into the corporation around what is needed in order to drive the business locally. So I would say empathy and really understanding of the mechanics of taking something that's created at a very high level and translating it down into the field. A good example was when I lived in India. When I lived in India, Windows 8 was coming out, if you remember that product, right? And Windows 8 was the first sort of time that Microsoft had an app store. Well, we were sitting in India and we had no apps for our app store, right? And the corporation's telling us, go fill your store with local Indian apps. So we had to sort of figure out how to do that. We ended up renting out a cricket stadium. We set a Guinness record for the most number of developers coding for 24 hours under one roof. We had a lot of Indian developers doing that, and we started filling up our store. So it's sort of figuring out what is the direction from the corporation and how do you translate that locally in this case.
That's interesting. And we just had a recent conversation, recent episode, which I think is actually going to come out after this one, but about the current business reality where people sometimes feel stifled in their careers because they're in a corporate setting and they don't necessarily see, the real world impact of what they're doing. But you were able to sort of find the space where you are bridging the stuff that goes on in the big towers of Silicon Valley or wherever they may be to stuff actually happening on the ground. So I'm sure that was very interesting for you to see as well.
Yeah, it was. It certainly was.
So just to clarify something, you before you actually moved to these places, you were still traveling heavily before then, or your heavy travel was when you made that shift?
I was always kind of in field facing roles at Microsoft. So my team or my job or my team's job was to really make sure that we were that translation layer out to the field. So, I remember as early as, I started at Microsoft in 1995. I remember as early as 1996 taking my first trip to India. I mean, to me, it sort of felt like going to Mars or something. I had never been to India. I didn't know anything about it, but I was used to that kind of motion, to learning how to operate, in the field and in foreign countries. And I would say very early on in my career at Microsoft, I had to start figuring out how to be a frum Jew while doing that as well. And I'm sure we'll get into that, but that requires a lot of kind of planning as well.
Yes, I would love to hear, even going back to those very early days, before the widespread usage of apps to find a minion and to order a meal or whatever it might be. So what are some of your early memories about, getting on that plane, landing in Mars, as you said, with your on one hand, figuratively with your knapsack, your briefcase, and your business responsibilities. On the other hand, or in your heart, your Torah responsibilities and values. So what was that like? What are your memories? What were some of the challenges early on?
Right. So, I think there's no question that I have to give credit, a huge amount of credit to Chabad. I mean, without Chabad, it would literally not have been possible. And, I continue to believe until today, and we could talk more about it, that Chabad is one of the most efficient organizations, for helping folks like me who were in that situation. So I was very, very lucky that I was the beneficiary of Chabad's kindness and many of the shlichim and their families' kindness. I also, in the early days, as you say, there weren't smartphones, or it took a little while for smartphones and the prevalence of apps and things to be able to find information. I brought a lot of food with me, a lot of bars, a lot of even bars weren't that popular back then in 1996, 1997, in the early 2000s. So I brought a lot of food, and and that's how I was able to get by, at least from a eating perspective. I remember a very early trip. It was probably 1996, going to Dubai for the first time. Now, most people who go to Dubai today, especially Israelis, they go to Dubai and they think that was what Dubai has always been. Well, I could tell you, in 1996, I went to the show called GITEX, the biggest technology show in the Middle East. It didn't look at all like it looked like today. There was no buildings going on. There was none of that. And I remember not being super sure how to make sure that I didn't lose my tefillin on the way in. And I remember taking my tefillin bag and turning it inside out, so that the Hebrew writing wasn't on the outside. Turned out to be no problem at all. But those are some of the things I guess I thought about way back when. As I've traveled to many, many more countries, I've never run into that problem. I've never run into a challenge like that. But those are some of the things that I thought about as well.
It's something interesting that as I hear you talk about the widespread usage of energy bars or granola bars in your travels, just something a little bit off topic, but I've thought about it a lot since a conversation with a friend of mine who was a mifaked in Gaza actually, and he said that one of the things that he was most makpid on with his soldiers was to make sure that at every possible time that they could have some sort of hot meal, that they should have it, because the hot meal was so important for their motivation and their mental health and their performance. I've thought about that. I don't know necessarily why that's so, or why that's so important. Do you have any insights on that world and how we relate to our food and our mental health based on your sort of experience eating all these different things in different points of your life?
I think the reason, probably, I don't know the mifaked, but I feel like it because it feels more like home. I remember in the late 1990s going to Switzerland, and someone told me about this restaurant, this kosher restaurant in Switzerland. It turned out that it was basically in someone's house. So, I took a taxi. There were no Ubers back then. I took a taxi. I found this place, and I didn't know what it was, and it sort of felt like I was walking into someone's house, and it felt more like home. When you're eating an energy bar, you're probably sitting on the bed in your hotel room, and that's what you're eating, right? I remember, if I knew I was going to be stuck over Shabbos, having to think about bringing, little bottles of grape juice, small rolls, things like that. So at least I could make kiddush and have lechem mishnah, but knowing that I wasn't going to have necessarily a very filling meal if I couldn't find a place. Like, for example, I spent Shabbos in India. I don't think I ate very well in India. I think it's also in those earlier days, because you didn't have kosher near me and other apps like that, you had to be a little bit more of a detective. You had to sort of figure out where things were and plan your schedule around that.
You're probably also forced to learn a lot more of halachos, because if you have a restaurant or a Chabad house with a 5-star kosher, so you go, you swipe your credit card, you get a glatt kosher meal. Otherwise, you're forced to actually understand there are halachos and there are things you're not allowed to eat, but there are also things that maybe surprisingly you can eat, or just understanding that. I'm sure that was an interesting experience as well.
It was. For example, when I lived in Munich, I became aware of this thing that I never knew existed. It's called the list. What's the list? So, the local rabbi of the shul in Munich, who at the time I was there, 2000, 2005, 2006, I think he learned in Eretz Yisrael. He had the list of the products that you could buy in the store that were kosher. They may not have had a hashgacha necessarily. They had a different kind of hashgacha that you weren't necessarily familiar with, but you had to learn about, who has the list. It was typically the local rabbi of the community, or the Chabad for that matter. So you had to become familiar with that too. Now all of that stuff is online, and it's a lot easier.
Okay, so about your Torah learning, you certainly enjoy a good limud, whether it's a shir or other things that you learn. So tell us a little about that. And specifically, we associate, you mentioned before, Shaalvim, you mentioned our Torah learning with a base medrash and an atmosphere and a group.
Right.
So you didn't have that luxury, I'm assuming, for the most part. And yet Torah study is still saying that stayed with you. So talk a little bit about how that developed throughout the course of your career.
Yeah. I mean, when I went to Shaalvim, I would honestly say in a very humble way, I don't think I was one of the best learners at Shaalvim. I remember showing up the first day and going to shir from Rav Yammer, who I'm still in touch with now. He's the Rosh Yeshiva. And I remember walking out of that shir saying, "Wow, like I didn't understand anything." He's giving shir in Hebrew. My Hebrew was okay, but it wasn't that great. And after a few weeks, looking around the base matters of Shaalvim and saying, it's quite possible that I am the worst learner in this entire yeshiva, which is a very humbling experience. When you come from high school and you think you're doing pretty well, and then you get to, a place that you feel like, well, I'm not doing that well. And I did the best I could that year. I learned to the best of my ability and went on to college and always tried to make learning a part of my day. It was actually in 2005 when I moved to Munich that I was having a conversation with my father, and we said, the new cycle of Daf Yomi was coming up, and we said, wouldn't it be great if we could both do Daf Yomi and be Messiahim together? I had never done Daf Yomi before. I knew what it was, but I certainly was not in that kind of cycle. And it wasn't that I was learning with my father every day, but we were both on the daf together. So I remember, buying Gemaras ahead of my stay in Munich. And every time I go back to the US, getting the new Gemaras, and I would sit on the train to work and I would learn. Over the course of time, it actually extended into my stay in India. My father and I were Messiahim together. We went to, I think it was the 11th Siyum Shas. We went to, MetLife Stadium. I say it was one of the greatest experiences of my life. We went with my uncle David Alvashalom, my brother Avi, and we sat there with 100,000 people. And it was really like, to me, it was an unbelievable thing. And I remember after the Siyum sort of going back and saying, wow, like I don't think I could do that again. That was that was a killer for 7.5 years to do this. And honestly, I was doing it mostly by myself. I wasn't part of a shir because I was living abroad. I guess there were shir in Moscow or in Prague. Maybe there were, but I wasn't aware of them. And it wasn't quite as easy back then, to log on to all daf and have this, embarrassment of riches. If you could listen to Rav Leibowitz from Rosner, you could listen to tens of different people giving shir at any pace and any language and anything you want. So I was mostly, doing it with an art scroll. I've got my travel edition that I go with everywhere, and that's how I was doing it. And it took me a lot longer. And then I thought I wasn't going to be able to do it again. And after a few weeks, I realized I was missing it. So I said, all right, this is really a part of my day, and I'm going to keep going. And I was able to, thank God, be Messiahim again for the 12th Siyum Shas, and then I think it was the 12th, whatever the last one was. And then I was talking to my cousin, Rav Yonason Sachs, who's the Rosh Yeshiva of Landers, and he said something to me that stuck with me for a very long time. He said, there's an incredible amount of downtime in life, and you need to think about your downtime and how to really maximize that. So, so for me, I spend a lot of time in airports, getting to airports, sitting on airplanes and things like that. So I did a little bit of a calculation, a little bit of a cheshbon, and I realized that, you think about this for a second. You go to the airport, maybe you're someone that likes to get there right before the flight. Maybe you're someone that likes to get there a little bit early. But I was finding that typically I would have about 30 or 40 minutes sitting at the gate, waiting to board the plane. And then when you get on the plane, you typically have another 30 minutes or so till something happens, till you take off. Not to mention the flight. The flight could be a few hours. It could be 6 hours. People do their own things. Maybe they learn. Maybe they work. Maybe they read a book. Maybe they close their eyes. Put that aside for a second. You have 30 to 40 minutes before you take off. You have 30, before you get on the plane, 30 minutes before you take off. When you land, you have at least another 10, 15 minutes till you get to the gate and people get up and the whole thing. You could really learn a tremendous amount during that time. So I said, well, I wonder if I can keep to my regular Seder. I like to learn after davening, so I like to learn the daf or anything else after davening. But I wonder if I could do a second daf just in that sort of time that is downtime, as my cousin Rav Sachs said. So I set for myself a goal that for this cycle, I was going to try to do 2 daf a day. and be Messiah twice, in the same cycle. Someone told me actually this past Shabbos that there's a famous Rosh Yeshiva. He didn't tell me who it was, so if you know, that would be great. It said he finished the daf in 5 minutes. What was the 5 minutes? It was the 5 minutes, the constant 5 minutes that people have where they can learn. And I think that's a really, really good point, not just for learning, certainly for learning, but for many things in life. There is a lot of downtime in life, and how you maximize it, I think can separate you from others in life. So that's kind of what I've been doing.
So that was really special. I was most moved actually by the description of those first few weeks where you dropped it and felt like it was such a part of you that you couldn't leave it and you had to bring it back, which is really special to hear. So a few sort of follow-up questions. I want to go back to like the early days where you're just picking it up and you said it wasn't like you weren't, one of those top guys going back to your yeshiva days, but you were picking up the daf. You mentioned the art scrolls, the connection with your father, and train rides, all things which are very important for learning, and I'm sure they're very helpful. Were there any other things that kept you motivated and kept you committed? Before it was so ingrained and such a part of you, it can be a journey, and there's easier days and harder days. So I'm wondering what else kept you going during the early period.
Yeah, I think I realized, Yaakov, that there was probably a lot more that I could have done when I was learning at Shaalvim to maximize my time there. I spent 1 year there. I didn't go for Shana Bet, which is more the norm now. And I've always felt, I think, since that year that I'm catching up, that I sort of missed, maximizing my opportunity. And I think that has fueled a lot of my learning. I think also I have this incredible desire to really know Shas. That's a huge dream of mine. I was actually, someone sent me this video a few weeks ago. You might know it more than I do. I think it's called Shas Yidden, where it was this, group of 40 guys sitting at a table with these different, Rosh Yeshivas, just peppering them with questions about Shas. And they just know it. They know everything, right? What an accomplishment to be able to do that. When you listen to someone like Rav Rosner or Rav Leibowitz, and you see them give daf every day, but you realize that it's not just about giving the daf yomi, that they really know Shas. They know the whole thing. It's an incredible thing, and that was really, I'd say, an early motivation of mine. I'm obviously very, very far from that, but I felt like, again, my cousin Rav Yonason Sachs, he talks a lot about chazara. You're not going to know any Masechta, whatever Masechta it is, you're not going to know a Masechta by going through it once or twice or four. You got to go through it 40 times, 50 times, 100 times to really know it. There's a famous story about my Zeta, the heart sphere of Tzvi Pesach Frank, when he was young and he was sent to yeshiva by his father with Rav Shmuel Salant. He showed up, I think he was probably about 20, 21, and he was paired up with his chavrusa, Rav Yechiel Michal Tugashinsky. Now, these were young people, right? These were like Yechiel Michal and Tzvi Pesach, right? They weren't who they became. And at some point, Yechiel Michal Tugashinsky went to the Rosh Yeshiva and said, I can't learn with Tzvi Pesach anymore. He said, why? He said, so they're learning Yevamos. He said, we've gone through Yevamos 40 times, and Tzvi Pesach wants to go through it again. So the Rosh Yeshiva came over to my Zeta and he said, what's going on? Like, you've gone through Yevamos so many times. He said, the first 40 times are to really know it, because one day I'm going to need to know the halachas of Yevamos. The next 40 times are to appreciate the sweetness of what it means to learn Yevamos and what it means to learn that Gemara. And I think there's something to that. The hasmada that you see from people like that, who just, they chazer it all the time, and eventually they're kona it and they know it. And that to me is a very big motivation as well.
Wow. And then the other thing that you sort of spoke about was the second daf you've picked up, the downtime daf, which I just thought was a cool phrase. Maybe we could copyright that and do something with that. But that's an interesting topic, and we've actually discussed it on this podcast a little bit, because I certainly realize that the day is filled with these pockets of time. On the other hand, I personally have a very hard time, focusing on anything sort of real during that time. And there's always the distraction, the temptation of flipping through messages and through statuses, and less cognitive load during those pockets of time. So do you have any advice? I mean, the airport is an interesting one because it's like 40 minutes. That is a block of time. Even on the smaller bits of time, how to maximize them in a way, because we complain about not having enough time, but we do have all this time. So wondering if you have any other advice for me, who has a hard time focusing in these pockets, how to make the most of it.
I mean, it's super hard, right? I mean, with my partner Gershon, we're running a company, right? it's a significant company, and we have a lot of people that depend on us, and we're moving fast, and that's a big job that we have. So there is a huge temptation to check your email, to do a call, to do something like that. I definitely think that you need to have a block of time. It's hard for me to kind of resonate with what I said before, the 5 minute daf. But yes, I think you could do that. You could open your Gemara and learn for 5 minutes. You could learn anything for 5 minutes. But having a block of time where you're dedicating it, so again, I like to learn after davening. I guess when I started Daf Yomi, the famous book Atomic Habits didn't exist, right? That everyone reads. But when you make it part of your schedule, it becomes part of your schedule, and you just sort of do it. So I know that after davening, I'm not looking at email, I'm not making calls, I'm learning. And I know that when I get to the airport and I'm sitting at the gate waiting to board, I take my Gemara out and I'm learning, and I'm not replying to emails. I think making it part of your schedule. My business partner Gershon is much better at it than I am in terms of his allocation of time. I've never seen anyone who could allocate time like he does. He may waste no time possibly in a day, I'm not sure. But I think that's what it is saying to yourself you're not going to do those other things, but having a meaningful enough block of time to be able to do it.
Wow. And it's really just special just reflecting on hearing you talk about this journey. I was blessed with a wonderful yeshiva experience, and now I'm trying to continue my growth post yeshiva. But to hear how it's never too late, and the fact that you did whatever you did in yeshiva, to each their own, and within the situation that they found themselves in, they have to look at what they have in front of them and try to maximize that and not give up on any big dreams. It was really special to hear. So thank you for that. I wanted to just talk a little bit about your family, or your role as a husband, as a father, with all this travel, moving all over the world. So I guess the first question that I've been thinking about as you talked about your career is, when you started to move to these places with a family, why move? Were these, with flights nowadays, would it be that hard to leave your family and to commute and be home for weekends and stuff like that? But why was the decision to move your family, and what was that like for you?
Yeah, I mean, I can only speak about my experience at Microsoft, but at Microsoft, if you were going to do a job where you were in the field, you had to be in the field. You couldn't be commuting and doing that. So you had to agree to move your family and become a global resource, live in the place. And honestly, I would say of all the places I lived, I grew professionally, but I also grew personally as well, right? I mean, to have to, on my first abroad trip with my family, to have to do the work, that's one thing. But to have to learn how to open a bank account in a different language, to go shopping, to get around on the bus and the train and all those things, you grow as a person, and you learn how to be quite self-sufficient and have to deal with situations that you've never had to deal with before. So that was never really an option, I would say, to just commute to any of those jobs. I know that's sort of a thing, perhaps in Israel, where people have a job in the US, they go for some amount of time and then they come back. I understand that, but that was never an option for me. In my first trip, I certainly moved with my family, and my kids were there. My oldest son Jordan, I mean, he was only 5. He went to the Bavarian International School. That was interesting. It brought with it its own challenges. My twins, my 2 younger kids, they went to sort of a play group run by a woman from New Zealand. So you just you have to acclimate, and you learn about all these ways of doing things. But of course, like anyone else, we had to figure out, where were we going to live. What's the closest shul? How do we find an apartment that's in walking distance to the shul? It turned out there was one 4 or 5 blocks away, in Munich. It was a very interesting shul, actually, and the rabbi was the Chabad rabbi that they sort of engaged to be the rabbi of the shul, but it was mainly, much older German individuals. So I learned a lot doing that. But where are you going to live? Where's the supermarket? How do you get the food? Are there any kosher restaurants? You think about all those things. And what are you going to do to make sure your kids, who were quite young at the time, 5, 2, and 2, were going to continue to be able to get a Jewish education? Is there someone that could tutor them? Is there someone who, can supplement their learning in the, more secular schools that they were in?
So it's very interesting. And want to get back to the sort of family aspect in a moment. When you spoke about the personal growth that you were forced into moving to all these places, it got me thinking. I don't know if you've ever reflected on this. If you were maybe 2 decades later in your timeline, and at a time where the apps for translation and navigation are so advanced, that combined with maybe a mentality that people accuse the younger generation of looking for more comforts and not going out of their comfort zone as much. It's an Aliyah discussion that people talk about how much discomfort and risk are people willing to take to move from America to Israel? Do you think would have been different? Because it's fascinating to hear how you were forced into a very difficult situation and it really grew from it. But nowadays, between the tools at our disposal and a certain mentality that people claim might exist with younger kids, younger generations, maybe it would look a lot different.
In my earlier years of living abroad, it was harder. In my more recent abroad experiences, India and Brazil, those tools basically existed. Maybe not quite as good as they are today, but you could use Google Translate. You could use, I mean, I was working for Microsoft, so we had to try to use Bing Translate, which wasn't very good. But there was Google Maps, there was Google Translate, so they had some of that. I remember going into the grocery store in Brazil, and I was taking Portuguese lessons, but it wasn't really sticking that well. And I kept trying to figure out, where's the peanut butter? Do you have peanut butter here? Like that seems to be a staple. Actually, it turns out if you live in Brazil, people in Brazil don't eat peanut butter very much, so you can't find it in grocery stores. But I would use the translation apps to do it. Back in 2005 and six, those were much less prevalent, as were smartphones. So it was definitely harder than I would imagine it is today if you were doing something like that as well.
But just like that mentality of like out of your comfort zone leading to amazing growth. Do you think that you would have still been able to do that nowadays, or would have been a totally different ballgame?
I think maybe a little bit different, not totally different. I remember someone asking me when I moved to India, a friend of mine, she lived in Teaneck, and she said, "Oh, you're going to be living in Bangalore. Is Bangalore as big as Teaneck?" I said, "Well, I don't know. How big is Teaneck?" So I didn't know. I went onto Wikipedia and I looked, and I can't remember the number of people who live in Teaneck, but it was something like 30,000 maybe, or something like that at the time. I said, yeah, in Bangalore, there's about 9.5 million people. There's probably 30,000 people on my street. So having to acclimate and having to learn about how to just even get around in a place that has that many people. And, India, of course, the two predominant religions are certainly not Judaism, right? I mean, so having to exist with millions and millions of people where you are the true minority, not just the true minority, but really the minority, where you may go weeks without seeing another Jewish person, is a real difference also.
Right. So going back to your role as a father and a husband throughout this period, did you ever have any doubts or regrets or second thoughts about this seemingly crazy decision from an outsider's perspective to raise a Jewish family for a couple years at a time in places, as you mentioned, so far from the classic Jewish infrastructure? I'm wondering if that was something that gnawed at you at any point.
Yeah, of all those abroad assignments, the only time I really had my family with me was when I was in Munich. And, if I'm honest with myself, I don't think I did the best job in making sure everything was great, right? I mean, I think I did a good job and I did as best as I could. But, we landed in Munich, and every day I'm traveling to Russia, to Poland, to the Czech Republic, to many different places. And I probably could have done a much better job making sure that my family felt that they had I guess you'd say in Israel, that they had a tochnit. My kids did, but at the time, my wife, who I was married to, it was probably much harder on her, I would say. So I always tell people when they're thinking about moving abroad, you really need to sit down with your family and talk about it and really make sure that everyone is going to have a tochnit, whether it's making Aliyah or whether it's going to some other country. What is everyone going to do every day? Because it can't just be about you going to work, because then you're going to leave everybody back at home and they're going to, struggle a little bit. And I think that was probably a very big and important learning that I had, particularly after my time in Munich, that I try to share with people as much as I can.
Right. So we're going to transition to a few other things, but just last point on the travel part of this conversation, which is the bulk. Um, any other thoughts about, I would say, like hashkafa, being a Jew who cares about Judaism and is motivated to continue to be better a little bit at a time, again, sort of on your own, finding your own motivation, finding your own source of fire and growth. Any other thoughts about that, broadly speaking, throughout your period being in all these different places with very little in terms of outside influences on your Judaism and on your growth, but finding it sort of in yourself or within other creative sources?
I think that the most important thing is realizing that when you're living, let's call it somewhere else, not your hometown, that you need to make yourself part of the community that you're living in. You need to contribute to that community. I mean, in many places that I lived in, the people who were the stalwarts of the community, again, and many times Chabad, they're being incredible Mesiras Nefesh to live there and to do things and to make sure that there's a home for people like me who are coming. you need to contribute back to them, whatever that means, whether it's, reading the Torah on Shabbos, whether it's, doing some sort of chesed, whether it's contributing money to the community, whatever it is that needs to be done, showing up early to, set up for Shabbos dinner, if the place is doing that. You can't act as an outsider. I think the biggest mistake people make when they, and I'm talking here personally and also in business, when they move to another place, not immersing themselves in the community. When I moved to India, honestly, I didn't know much about Hinduism. I didn't, but I knew that the majority of the people on my team were Hindus. So I wanted to learn as much as I could about it, not, chas v'shalom, to practice it myself, but at least to be aware of what people are doing so I could be a better person and I could, and I could be more empathetic to what, they're going through, what their holidays are and festivals and things like that. From the perspective of being a frum Jew, I think it's very natural for frum Jews to try to contribute back to the community. And that's easier when it's a community of people that you know. It's much harder when you're entering a new community where nobody knows you and you don't know them. But if you show up in a way that, hey, I know I'm a guest, but I'm here to help the community be successful, even if I know I'm only going to be here for a few years or a few months or whatever the period of time is, I think that lands very well with the community, and it definitely ingratiates you, to them and makes your stay a lot more pleasant.
That's very interesting. When I heard you talk about giving back and contributing, it certainly is important, and we believe in chesed and hakaras hatov. When you think about someone who's in an office in Tel Aviv or New York City, and so obviously being a part of the community, being a contributing person and a nice person is important, but those experiences come with a certain danger that sometimes, there are people who have very different values, and you don't want that to rub off on you too much. You want to be able to give, and get, but also sort of keep your own sense of values and not allow yourself to slip away from what you believe in. Listening to you, it's actually a little bit different because when the culture is so different, right? It's maybe there's more of a natural distance that you can be a little freer to give. Also, your limited time, say a little freer to give and immerse yourself without really being as influenced. Is that a correct read of the situation?
Yeah, I mean, look, when I lived in Brazil, I was there for 3 years. My team was largely made up of fairly younger people. So I would get invited to many different things as the leader of the team, right? I would get invited to, let's say, someone's birthday party, right? Or their child's birthday party. And as much as I could, I would try to go and show support for the team. But I would also be invited, to go to a club after hours or go to the beach with a bunch of people. And I felt like that wasn't something that I should be doing. And I would tell people that. I said, that's not really something that I do, but have a great time and we'll see you at Monday at the office. Where you can integrate yourself in a halachically acceptable way with the team, I think it goes very far in helping you build that trust with the team. And here I'm really talking about purely from a business standpoint. You do as the outsider need to build trust. It's something that I think about a lot. I've thought about a lot living in many places. If you come in as, the old book, The Ugly American, is called, right? If you come in as the ugly American, like, well, I'm the American, you all are the Brazilians, I'm going to manage you the way I want to manage you, that's not going to last very long, right? So you have to find ways to connect. And as a frum Jew, where you could connect in a halakhically acceptable way, and in a way that allows you to adhere to your core values and to halacha, I think you should do it as much as you can, even if it makes you slightly uncomfortable. But as long as it adheres to halacha, and the times where it does not adhere to halacha, you have to be very firm and say, that's really not something that I do. If you need to explain it more, you can say, my religious beliefs don't really allow me to do that. And I tend to find people are very understanding of that in this day and age, much more so than maybe in the past.
Amazing. So through our conversation about your travels, we've come onto so many values. You spoke about trust and empathy and giving back to the community. Are there any other core values that you have learned throughout the years, developed throughout the years? You also mentioned in the beginning, I'll add maybe a part two to this question, is that you mentioned that a lot of things in Shaalvim that you learned actually were expressed or understood or really clicked to you at a later point in life. So I'm wondering if other important values from yeshiva or not from yeshiva that you learned throughout your journey that we haven't yet touched on.
Yeah, I would probably point to two. The first is something that my previous CEO, Satya Nadella, said when he became the CEO, and I think it's tremendous, tremendous insight, particularly from Jews. You need to be a learn-it-all person, not a know-it-all person. A lot of people approach conversations, from the standpoint of, I know everything there is to know about this, which might be true. You might actually know more than the person. But if you approach every interaction and every conversation as a learn-it-all person, you're going to be a richer person. That was something that they didn't use that exact, lashon at Shaalvim, but at Shaalvim it was always about being a worldly person, about being able to sort of take the best from everyone that you met and apply it to your Yiddishkeit, let's say. And I think, although Satya doesn't know anything about Shaalvim necessarily, I think he codified it in a way that makes a lot of sense. And it allows you to also, I think, approach conversations, approach situations with a certain sense of humility that, hey, I don't know everything there is to know. I can learn something from every person that I interact with every day. And I think that's a tremendous insight for people. The other that I talk about a lot, that my business partner Gershon and I talk about a lot in our company, is being an outside in company. We talked about this a little bit earlier, that the truth is found at your customer or partner. So, you could sort of sit in the proverbial ivory tower and come up with a bunch of products and come up with a bunch of things. But we always took the opposite approach at Nerdio. At Nerdio, we always start with the customer and work our way back in. What do they need? What are the pain points that we're trying to solve? And that's what guides us 100% of the time. Of course, we have our own ideas. Of course, we have our own IP, our own things that we think will work, but we always test those with customers to make sure. So being an outside in person, in a way, is very much like being a learn-it-all person as well. And I think those two values, or core values, if you will, are something that stayed with me for a long time.
Wow. And you mentioned before your illustrious ancestors of Pesach Frank. So can you tell us a little bit more about, you mentioned some of the stories, but how, being from such a rich Torah family has led you, inspired you, and guided you throughout your journey?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, well, I have a lot of cousins named Tzvi Pesach. I have a son named Tzvi Pesach. So I think it certainly comes with a responsibility not to be exactly like him. I think I forgot who it was. Maybe Rav Aryeh Leibowitz said once, you're not going to wake up and be Rav Shachter, right? But that's not necessarily the goal, to be Rav Shachter. The goal is to take what you can from the Har Tzvi, from Rav Shachter, from Rav Rosner, people like that, and as much as you can apply it, to your own learning. The Har Tzvi, when he was in the year of Avelis, he learned Maseches Beitza, right? So people learn Maseches Beitza. The Beitza is round; it represents the cycle of life. So he would make a siyum on Maseches Beitza every day of his year of Avelis, every day. So someone said, you could say, well, that seems really hard. Okay, it's 40 blot. It's possible, right? I'm sure at the beginning, if someone tried to do that, it would be hard. It would be difficult, and you might struggle with that. To learn 40 daf in a day is super hard. But I think, as Rabbi Yisachar Frand said, I think it was at the 11th Siyum Shas, beyond your reach is really within your grasp, and you just have to start. You have to start somewhere. I tell our team that all the time. Something seems insurmountable. Something seems very difficult. You have to start. You have to try it. You have to see, what you accomplish. I've always been struck by the famous Gemara. You learn Shas, and let's say you're going in order. You get to the end. You're in Seches Nida Daf Ayin Amud Beis. What does a person need to do to attain Chachma? You increase your learning. You minimize, let's say, the daily pursuits. The Gemara goes on and says, Harbi Asu V'lo Hoil. Many people did that and were not successful. What's the answer? Aliyah Vakesh Rachamim Mimisha Chachma Shelo. You also have to daven to Hashem to help you. So it's not enough to just sort of sit and learn every day. That's certainly a very important part. And we talked about the Chazara and going over it and over it till you're really kona it. But you also have to daven to Hashem. That has to be a meaningful part of your day as well. And you have to take that just as seriously, if not more seriously, than the actual learning. I'm always struck a little bit by, why didn't they start brachos daf bet with that? That would have been a little bit more useful if you're starting a show. Why do they wait till the end? But nevertheless, that's a meaningful learning. I think the other one, my cousin Rav Yonason Sachs always talks about a lot, which has stuck with me, which you look at incredible Torah personalities like my Zeta the Heart Sphere, many others. They didn't just acquire it, right? It didn't just happen overnight. If you look at Pirkei Avos and Daf Bet, you read about the students of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, and one of the famous students of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai is Rabbi Eliezer ben Horkanus. Rabbi Eliezer ben Horkanus is described as the bur sut she'eno me'abed tipa, right? He's the cistern through which a drop does not leak through. He had a photographic memory. All the Mefarshim say he had a photographic memory. But it's interesting, when you look at Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer in the first parak, Eliezer ben Hyrcanus didn't grow up knowing a lot of Torah. He was in the fields. His father, said to him, "Why are you crying, Eliezer?" He said, "I'm struggling with my learning." He didn't really know any learning. And through a series of events, he went to Rav Yochanan ben Zakkai. He showed up at Rav Yochanan ben Zakkai. He didn't know, any Torah, and he had to start from the beginning. The Gemara in Sukkah Daf Kavches, Miyamai lo kimani adam lebeis hamedrash. Rabbi Eliezer says, "In my days, nobody came to the base medrash before me. Nobody left after me." Eliezer ben Hyrcanus didn't, wake up and he was the Bursut Shanam Abitipa. He had to be the first one in the base medrash. He had to be the last one to leave. Anything you do in life requires a tremendous amount of amelus, a tremendous amount of work. Whether it's your secular pursuits, whether it's your learning pursuits, it doesn't just come to you. You have to sit and go over it and go over it and learn and put the hours in. And I think that's, to me, the biggest learning from, not just my Zeta, but many, many other people who I look at. I have on my desk, people laugh sometimes when they see it, a little desk in my bedroom. I have pictures of me with different Gedolim. People say, why do you have those? Because to me, it reminds me of what's important and who I am, right? That these are people who have attained incredible, incredible chachma, and who live a life of being a Torah Jew. So no matter what I'm doing, whether I'm doing something for Nerdio or something else, that's what's most important. Those are the people that I have to really model myself after and learn from.
Okay, so we've spoken about so many, chapters of your life stories. And I actually want to talk about maybe some of the next chapters that you have coming up, specifically the plans that we spoke about before, Aliyah, moving to Eretz Yisrael. So what do you want to share with our listeners about, what in your life has led you up to this point and what you're excited about moving forward?
Yeah, I mean, Mirza Hashem, I want to make Aliyah. I'm going to make Aliyah. We're, building a house in Nofi Hashemesh. So looking forward to spending as much time with Rav Rosner, who I learned with in Shaalvim as well there, and your father-in-law and many other, great people there. I think if you don't make Aliyah when you're younger, like you did, it's very hard. You get into your life and there's always excuses, maybe some of the same excuses people told me about why I shouldn't move abroad. People are going to forget you. It's going to be hard. I think one of the great regrets that I've had in life is not making Aliyah sooner. So, Amir Hashem, in the coming years, I look forward to being there in Nofi Hashemesh. And, beyond that, I spend a lot of my time growing Nerdio, achieved a number of big milestones in 2025. We became a unicorn with our latest funding round. We passed $100 million of ARR, but to Gershon and I, those are just the early steps of a lot more that we have to accomplish. And I think what transcends all of that is continuing to be a Torah Jew and to learn as much as I can, and to not just have the amelis, but to have the ideas as well, and to, be able to continue knowing the vastness of the Torah. That's I think the most amazing thing. When you learn Torah, you realize how vast it is and how much there is to really know.
Amazing. And I'm looking forward to diving with you and learning with you in Nefesh Shemesh as soon as possible. And that's really, really exciting. So hopefully the continuation of your building should be continue quickly, and the building of the shul should continue quickly. And shout out to everyone who's been involved in that special project. So really exciting to see. So we're actually doing something a little bit different. We normally have a lightning round, and we're going to do a regular lightning round in a minute. But I actually prepared another lightning round about your travel. So just a few rapid fire. Of all of the airlines you've ever flown, what was your favorite?
Oh, I'm a United flyer. I mean, Emirates is great and Singapore is great, but I'm a United flyer. It's just sort of easy for me.
And of all your travel experiences that are not on airplanes, whether it's different train routes, buses, other places you've traveled that are not in the sky, what's your favorite?
Going and seeing the Taj Mahal in India is something pretty remarkable. To imagine that all those years ago that was built and it's still unbelievable to look at is great. I mean, nothing beats, of course, going to Israel. That's a sort of, the number one travel experience, no matter what you do in Israel. Seeing the Taj Mahal is amazing. Standing in Red Square, which is kind of hard to do, these days. Not too many people are flying to Russia. That was pretty amazing. Seeing just the history, you when I was younger, I was always interested in history, but then being able to go to the places and actually see it, to see the jail that Nelson Mandela was housed in for many years, to go to places like this. I've been to 109 countries now, and I think there's people always ask me, what's your favorite one? There's something to see everywhere and something interesting to see everywhere.
Wow. And you mentioned you're a Karsa Tov to Chabad. Can you give a crown for the number one Chabad house that you visited?
Oh wow. The Chabad in Hong Kong, Rav Avtson, is amazing. He started that with his wife, I think in the late 1970s, and it's grown to a real powerhouse, that's sprouted probably in excess of 100 more Chabads across Asia. So Rabbi Abson and his wife are special people, and what they've built there in Hong Kong is amazing.
What's your favorite country without a Chabad?
I don't know that there is a country without a Chabad. I've been to Tunisia. I'm not sure that there's a Chabad there, but I wouldn't say Tunisia is my favorite country. So I'd have to think about that. Is there a place without a Chabad? I haven't encountered too many, to be honest.
Okay. I mean, when you were in Dubai in the 90s, they had or not yet?
They did not. They did not have. Now they have.
Okay. What's your favorite food that doesn't need hashgacha you can eat anywhere in the world?
Favorite food that doesn't need a hashgacha. I don't eat food that doesn't need a hashgacha, so I
Your
don't.
favorite fruit or favorite type of water bottle?
Mango probably. If you go to a place in India called Cochin, it's in the south of India. Allegedly they have 45 different varieties of mangoes, and you sort of drive around and you see them on the trees, and people own orchards of mangoes, and I would say mango.
All right, when you come to Israel, I'm going to show you some really amazing spots for growing mango in the desert, but that's for another time. What's one thing you can't travel without?
My art scroll Gemara for sure. I mean, of course they have, Safaria has done an amazing job literally giving you Torah at its fingertips, but I'm always with an art scroll Gemara, always.
Amazing. And by the way, you flashed your screen for the video with your article Gemara. You're coming to us from Amsterdam. Thank you for taking the time for speaking to us on the road. Last question for your travel rapid fire. What's one place that you've never been to that you still like to go to?
Ecuador. I've never been to the Galapagos, and I'm really, really dying to go there.
Okay, amazing. So now we're going to go to our classic rapid fire. 3 short questions, 3 hopefully short answers. We're in the winter. We have nice long Friday nights. What do you like to do at that time?
I'm pretty tired by the time I get home Friday night, so I tend to sleep a little bit early. I like to read. I have another project that I'm working on. I've been working on for a long time to read every literary fiction book from the New York Times notable book list from 1947 to present. So typically, in addition to my Gemara, you'll find me with some kind of book, either on my Kindle or, a paper book with me. So I'll read a lot.
Okay, what's your favorite sefer on the Parsha?
Rabbi Rosner's, Sfarim on the Parsha for sure. I'm hoping that there'll be a volume 3 and 4 and 5 and 6, but Shalom Rav on the Parsha is really great.
And not only have we had Ebraz on the podcast, we also had a very early episode with Mark Lesnick, who really is to credit him for the bulk of that work and the
I've
energy
never
behind
met
it.
Mark. If Mark's listening to this podcast, I'm dying to meet him. What he does in terms of disseminating Rav Rosner's Torah and Rav Asher Weiss's Torah, I've heard he's done hikes with Rav Asher Weiss. Where do I go to sign up for a hike with Rav Asher Weiss? That's unbelievable. So I'd love to meet him.
I don't have a link for that, but I will definitely introduce you. Finally, if you had to quit your job today, find something new, a new industry, a new position, maybe something you dreamed of doing as a kid, what would that be?
This is the last job I'm going to do is Nerdio. When I'm done with Nerdio, Mirz Hashem, I'm going to learn full time. That's what I'm going to do. I'm going to go back to Shaalvim. I've already told the Rosh Yeshiva I'm going to show up. And I don't know if I'll be in a shir, but I'm going to learn there and really make up for, the times that I probably could have learned a little bit better at Shaalvim. I'm going to keep going.
Okay, Joseph, Yossi Landis, thank you so much for joining us. It's been a very, very, very special conversation, and we really appreciate it.
Amazing. Thanks for having me, Yaakov. It's great to be on here.
And looking forward to sitting down with you in Eretz Yisrael as soon as possible. Thank you so, so much.
Thank you.